What happened when an old Texas rancher opened his door to two Apache sisters will shock you. The choice he made that night would change everything he believed about trust, forgiveness, and the past he could never escape. This is a story hidden in the pages of classic Western literature, a tale of courage that has waited over a century to be told. In the most desolate corner of the Texas border, where desert sands stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the wooden house of old rancher Mason stood alone beneath the moonlight. The wind whispered through dried grass as Mason sat on his porch, taking the last sip from his coffee cup, just as he had done every night for years. He was 65 years old and had spent the last 15 years on this ranch completely alone. Once he had lived a happy life here with his wife Clara and young daughter Emma, but those days were long gone. Mason's eyes were fixed on the horizon. There was nothing out there, just endless desert and a sky full of stars. He was about to go inside when he heard a sound in the distance. Horses? At this hour, in such a desolate place, his heart began to race. The pain he had carried for 15 years suddenly came alive again. The sound of horses grew closer. Mason immediately went inside and grabbed his rifle from beside the door. His hands were shaking, but he was determined. Whoever it was, they would not pass through that door. He had trusted once before and lost everything. Never again. When the knock came, Mason's breath caught. He slowly approached the door, gripping the rifle tightly. He shouted through the wood, his voice cutting through the desert silence, asking who was there. A young woman's voice came from outside, explaining they were only looking for a place to stay for one night, asking for nothing but shelter beneath a roof. Mason's mind raced with confusion. A woman's voice? At this hour? In this place? He demanded to know how many people were out there. The voice responded that there were two of them. She and her sister, explaining they had been traveling for a very long time and desperately needed help. Mason slowly opened the door, still holding his rifle ready. Before him stood two young Apache women. Both looked tired and dusty, but there was determination in their eyes. Their long black hair flowed down their backs, and their traditional Apache clothing was torn and worn. Mason's insides filled with memories of the past. 15 years ago, on a night just like this, an Apache group had attacked his ranch. That night he had lost his wife Clara and daughter Emma. Since that day he had not trusted any native person, could not trust them. He told them firmly to leave, saying he could not help them. One of the young women stepped forward, her eyes filling with tears, pleading that if he turned them away they might not survive until morning, mentioning the men who were following them. Mason declared that whoever was chasing them was not his concern, but there was hesitation in his voice. He told them to return to their tribe. The other woman, who appeared older, spoke with a calmer and more mature voice. She explained they were fleeing from their tribe, that their people wanted to take them back, but they wanted to be free. She made it clear that if he did not help them, those pursuing them would find them. Mason looked into the women's eyes. The fear and desperation he saw there momentarily reminded him of the feelings his own daughter must have experienced in her final moments. But no, he could not fool himself. These were Apache, the same blood as those who had killed his family. He insisted he could not listen to them, and began closing the door. The young woman cried out desperately, her voice filled with hopelessness. She asked if he had once had a daughter, mentioning she had seen the small swing on the porch. She begged him to think of them as he would think of his daughter, asking if someone had not helped her when she was afraid just as they were now. Mason froze. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. How did this woman know that swing had belonged to Emma? It still stood there with the small pillow Clara had sewn, carrying years of dust upon it. A long silence fell. The wind rustled against the wooden walls of his house. Mason's mind traveled back and forth between the past and present. What would have happened if someone had extended a helping hand to Emma that night? What if someone had saved her? But this was different. Emma had been an innocent child. These women were Apache. He asked what their names were, and there was a softening in his voice. The young woman identified herself as Ayana and introduced her older sister as Chenoa. She pleaded again, promising they would only stay until dawn. that when the sun rose they would leave and he would never see them again. Mason thought for a long time. The battle within him was clearly written on his face. Finally, taking a deep breath, he opened the door wider. He told them to come inside, but made it clear that if they tried any tricks, his rifle would be ready. Ayana and Chenoa entered gratefully. Mason led them to his small living room. The room was simple and sparse, containing a fireplace, an old armchair, and a rug. Clara had woven. On the wall hung the only photograph of his family, a picture of Clara, Emma, and young Mason from happier days. Chenoa noticed the photograph and stopped. She quietly observed that they had been a beautiful family. Mason did not respond. He threw some logs into the fireplace and stoked the fire. He told them they could sit down and reminded them they would be leaving in the morning. The two women sat down near the fireplace. For a while no one spoke. There was only the crackling of the fire and the sound of the wind outside. Finally Ayana spoke, expressing their gratitude and promising they would never forget this kindness. Mason remained standing, rifle in hand. He asked why they were running, his voice still distant. Chenoa answered while looking at the fire, explaining that their tribe wanted to marry them to old warriors, that this was not their choice, that they wanted to be free and live their own lives. Mason responded with bitterness in his voice. Questioning the notion of freedom, he declared that no one was free in these lands, that everyone was running from something, everyone had lost something. Ayana looked at Mason and asked if he had also lost something, mentioning the woman and girl in the photograph who were no longer there. Mason's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in 15 years he found himself defenseless when someone asked this question. He quietly revealed it had been 15 years that Apaches had attacked and taken everything from him. Silence filled the room. Chenoa and Ayana looked at each other. Then Chenoa stood and approached Mason, expressing deep sorrow and admitting they had not known, suggesting that if they had known they never would have come. Mason's voice was sharp and pained as he questioned what difference it would have made if they had known, pointing out that they still would have knocked on his door because they had no other choice. Chenoa agreed he was right, but asked him to understand that not all Apaches were the same, just as not all white men were the same, explaining that some of them only wanted to live in peace. Mason looked into the woman's eyes. He saw nothing there but sincerity. The anger inside him was slowly giving way to confusion. These women might be of the same blood as those who killed his family, but were they guilty? He finally told them to sit. His voice softened and said he would bring them some bread and water. He went to the kitchen and returned with an old loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. The women ate as if they were starving. As Mason watched them, he remembered how Emma used to eat the same way when she was little. Something stirred in his heart. He asked how long they had been traveling. Ayana answered it had been 3 days, explaining that their horses had died on the second day and they had been walking since then. Mason asked about the men following them. She revealed they were warriors from their tribe, sent to bring them back, and acknowledged they would probably be there by morning. Mason's heart raced. He asked if they meant tomorrow, if these warriors would find this place. Ayana confirmed they were following their tracks, and yes, they would find them. Mason jumped to his feet, insisting they must leave immediately, starting to say that if those men came there. Chenoa calmly finished his thought, acknowledging that they could harm him too, confirming they understood this reality. She reminded him they had promised to leave before dawn. But other thoughts were turning in Mason's mind. If these women left, the warriors would find them and take them back. Or worse, he thought about Emma desperately waiting for help that never came. Now at his own door, 2 women were looking at him with the same desperation. He surprised even himself by declaring they would stay, that they would remain there, and if the warriors came, he would handle it. Ayana's eyes widened in shock, protesting that it would be too dangerous for him. Mason picked up his rifle from the table and spoke about danger, saying he had forgotten what danger was for 15 years, suggesting perhaps it was time to remember again. Chenoa approached Mason and placed her hand on his shoulder, asking why he was doing this, reminding him they were Apache and he did not like them. Mason looked into the woman's eyes and admitted perhaps he did not like them, but explained that his daughter Emma, if she had lived, would have wanted someone to help people in need. He revealed that was the kind of girl she had been. And perhaps after 15 years it was time for him to do something worthy of her memory. The night deepened. Mason gave the women blankets and told them to rest. He himself sat in his chair by the fireplace, rifle across his lap, knowing sleep would not come easily. His mind was filled with memories and questions he had buried for so long. As the fire crackled and the women slept, Mason found himself staring at the photograph on the wall. Clara's smile, Emma's bright eyes, his own younger face full of hope. That man in the picture seemed like a stranger now. The attack had changed him, hardened him, turned him into someone who lived only in the past. But tonight something had shifted. Opening his door to these Apache women had cracked something open inside him, something he had sealed shut 15 years ago. He did not trust them. Not completely, but he had made a choice, for Emma. For the memory of who he used to be. The hours passed slowly. Mason watched the darkness outside through the window, listening for any sound of approaching riders. The desert was silent, except for the eternal wind. His hands remained steady on the rifle, but his thoughts were in turmoil. When the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Chenoa stirred and woke. She saw Mason still sitting there, vigilant, and something in her expression changed. She rose quietly and approached him. She spoke softly, acknowledging he had not slept, and thanked him again for his protection. But she insisted they should leave now before the warriors arrived, saying they did not want his blood on their hands. Mason shook his head firmly. He had made his decision and would not change it now. He told them to eat something and prepare themselves, explaining that when the warriors came, they would find something they did not expect. Ayana woke then and heard the end of their conversation. She protested that they could not let him risk his life for strangers, especially Apache strangers. Mason stood and faced both women. His voice was steady and clear, as he explained this was not just about them anymore. He revealed that for 15 years he had blamed all Apache people for what happened to his family, that he had let hate consume him, turning him into a bitter old man waiting to die. He acknowledged that helping them would not bring Clara and Emma back, but perhaps it would honor their memory better than his hatred ever had. The words hung in the air. Both women looked at this weathered rancher with new understanding. Chenoa stepped forward and placed both hands on Mason's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. She told him something he needed to know, something that might change everything. She revealed that 15 years ago, when the attack on his ranch happened, she had been there. She was only a child then, barely 12 years old, part of the raiding party, because her father was one of the warriors. She explained she had seen things that night that haunted her, still memories that drove her away from her tribe's violent ways. Mason's body went rigid. His hands tightened on the rifle as rage and shock flooded through him. This woman had been there the night his family died. But Chenoa continued speaking, her voice urgent and filled with pain. She revealed that the attack was not what he thought, that the warriors had not come to kill, but to retrieve something stolen from them. She explained that a white settler had kidnapped 2 Apache children weeks before, and the tribe was desperately searching. She admitted that when they arrived at his ranch that night and were met with gunfire, everything spiraled into chaos and tragedy. Mason's mind reeled. This version of events contradicted everything he had believed for 15 years. He demanded to know more, his voice shaking with emotion. Chenoa told him what she remembered. His wife Clara had tried to stop the fighting, had tried to explain there were no Apache children there. But in the darkness and confusion, her words were lost. She described how young Emma had run from the house, how one of the warriors had tried to catch her, not to harm her, but to stop her from running into the crossfire. But Emma had been so frightened, she had fled into the night, toward the canyon edge. Chenoa revealed she had followed Emma, had watched in horror as the little girl, blinded by fear and darkness, had stumbled at the canyon rim. Mason's legs nearly gave out. He sank into his chair, the rifle falling from his hands. All these years he had believed the Apache had killed Emma outright, had murdered her in cold blood. But if what Chenoa said was true, if Emma had died in a terrible accident during chaos that neither side had wanted, Chenoa knelt before him, tears streaming down her face. She spoke of how that night had changed her too, how she had tried to reach Emma in time but failed, how the image of that little girl falling had never left her dreams. She explained that was why she eventually fled her tribe, why she could not accept their warrior ways, why she and her sister now sought a different path. The room fell silent, except for the crackling fire. Mason sat there, his entire world reordering itself. 15 years of hate, of blame, of rage, directed at an entire people for what had been a tragic misunderstanding. A terrible accident, born of fear and violence on both sides. Ayanna spoke quietly, explaining they had not planned to tell him this, fearing his reaction. But she felt he deserved the truth, especially after his kindness to them. Mason raised his head and looked at Chenoa. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady, as he asked if she truly tried to save Emma. Chenoa nodded, her voice breaking as she swore she had tried with everything in her young heart, but she had been too small, too slow, too late. Something profound shifted in Mason's chest. The wall he had built around his heart began to crumble. This woman before him, this Apache woman, he had almost turned away, had tried to save his daughter. She had carried the guilt and trauma of that night, just as he had, her own innocence shattered by violence and loss. Mason reached out slowly and placed his weathered hand on Chenoa's shoulder. He told her he believed her, his voice thick with emotion. He revealed that part of him had always known something was wrong about that night, that the pieces never quite fit together. But it had been easier to hate than to question, easier to blame than to seek truth. The three of them sat together as dawn broke fully over the desert. They shared their grief, their regrets, their pain. For the first time in 15 years, Mason felt the weight on his soul begin to lift. Understanding did not erase the tragedy, but it transformed it from a source of hate into something that might eventually lead toward healing. But the moment of connection was shattered by the sound Mason had been expecting. Horses approaching fast, many of them. The Apache warriors had arrived. Mason stood quickly and retrieved his rifle. He told the women to stay inside while he went out to face the warriors. But Chenoa and Ayanna insisted they would stand with him, reminding him this was their fight too. The three of them walked out onto the porch together as the sun climbed over the horizon. A group of 7 Apache warriors rode up, led by a fierce-looking older man with gray streaking his hair. They pulled their horses to a stop, and the leader spoke in Apache, his words harsh and commanding. Chenoa responded in their language, her voice strong and defiant. The exchange was rapid and intense, filled with anger on both sides. Mason stood between the women and the warriors, his rifle ready but not aimed, showing he was prepared to fight but not eager for it. Finally, the warrior leader switched to English, probably for Mason's benefit. He declared that the women belonged to their tribe, that they were promised to warriors, that this was not the white man's concern. Mason stepped forward and spoke clearly. He told the leader this was his land. These women had asked for his protection, and he was giving it. He acknowledged he was 1 man against 7, but reminded them he had nothing left to lose and would make any attack very costly for them. The leader studied Mason with calculating eyes. He asked why a white rancher would risk death for Apache women, pointing out that white men and Apache had been enemies for generations. Mason's response was measured and powerful. He explained that he had learned something important the previous night, that hate and violence had taken enough from all of them, that perhaps it was time for something different. He revealed his own tragic history with the Apache, but explained he now understood that tragedy belonged to everyone, not just to one side or the other. He declared that these 2 women sought freedom and peace, and if the warriors wanted to take them, they would have to go through him first. The words settled over the group. The warriors shifted restlessly on their horses, but something in Mason's bearing gave them pause. This was not the response they had expected. Then Chenoa spoke again in Apache, her words clear and passionate. She addressed the leader directly, who Mason now realized must be her father. She spoke of the past, of the pain their people carried, of the cycle of violence that had consumed too many lives. She revealed what she had told Mason about that night 15 years ago, explaining how witnessing that tragedy had changed her forever. She declared she could not live in a world where might made right, where women were property, where the old ways demanded blood and submission. Ayana joined her sister's plea, adding her own voice to the argument. She spoke of wanting to learn new ways, of seeking peace with all people, of believing their people could be strong without being violent. The father sat motionless on his horse, his face showing the internal struggle between tradition and love for his daughters. Finally he spoke, and though Mason could not understand all the Apache words, he could hear the pain in them. Chenoa translated quietly for Mason. She explained that her father acknowledged their courage, but feared for their safety in the white man's world. He worried they would face hatred and violence, that they would be alone and unprotected. Mason surprised himself by stepping forward and addressing the Apache leader directly. He admitted his own prejudice and hatred, confessing how it had poisoned him for years. But he suggested there might be another way forward, a way that honored both past and future. He offered an unexpected proposal. If the warriors would let the women stay with him for one season, he would teach them what they needed to know to survive in both worlds. He promised to protect them and train them, and at the end of that time they could choose their own path freely. The offer hung in the air. It was unprecedented, strange, and perhaps impossible. A white rancher offering to mentor Apache women, the warriors muttered among themselves, clearly uncertain. But the father looked long and hard at Mason, seemed to see something in the old rancher's face that made him consider the proposal seriously. He asked what Mason would gain from this arrangement, wondering why he would take on such a burden. Mason's answer was simple and profound. He explained that he had lost his own daughter 15 years ago and had spent every day since then dying slowly inside. He suggested that perhaps teaching these women, protecting them, giving them the chance his own Emma never got, might finally allow him to live again. He acknowledged it would not erase the past, but it might redeem some small part of it. Long moments passed, while the leader deliberated. Finally he spoke in English, addressing Mason directly. He acknowledged that what the rancher proposed was unusual and would anger some in the tribe, but he admitted he had seen too much death, too much loss. He agreed to the arrangement with conditions. The women would have one full cycle of seasons with Mason, learning what they needed. At the end of that time, they would return to the tribe's borders and decide their future freely. If they chose to leave their people permanently, he would not pursue them further. But if anyone harmed them during that year, the entire tribe would return for vengeance. Mason accepted these terms immediately. He gave his word, as a man of honor, that the women would be safe, that he would treat them as he would have treated his own daughter. The warriors turned their horses to leave, but the father lingered a moment longer. He looked at his daughters and spoke to them in Apache, words that brought tears to their eyes. Then he looked at Mason one final time and gave a single nod of respect before riding away with his men. As the dust settled and the warriors disappeared over the horizon, the three of them stood together on the porch in stunned silence. What had just happened seemed impossible. A bridge built across decades of hatred and mistrust in a single morning. Chenoa and Ayana turned to Mason with expressions of disbelief and gratitude. They had expected to fight, to flee, or to die. Instead, they had been given a precious gift, time, protection, and the chance to forge their own destinies. Mason felt something he had not experienced in 15 years. Hope, not the naive hope of his younger days, but something deeper and harder won, hope built on truth and understanding rather than ignorance. The months that followed transformed all three of them. Mason began teaching the sisters everything they needed to survive and thrive. He showed them how to manage a ranch, how to deal with white settlers and traders, how to read and write English, how to navigate the complex and often hostile world they were entering. But they taught him as well, sharing Apache wisdom about the land, about medicine, about seeing the world through different eyes. Chenoa proved to have a gift for healing. She combined Apache plant knowledge with techniques she learned from Mason's old medical books, and soon people from neighboring ranches began coming to her for help. Word spread of the Apache healer at Mason's ranch, and though some came with suspicion, most left with respect. Ayana discovered a talent for breeding and training horses. She had an almost supernatural ability to communicate with the animals, gentling even the wildest mustangs with patience and understanding. Mason's small ranch began to gain a reputation for quality horses, and his fortunes improved for the first time in years. But more than practical skills, they learned to live together as a family of sorts. Mason found himself laughing again, telling stories, remembering how to be human rather than just surviving. The women brought life back to the lonely ranch, filling the silence with conversation, filling the empty rooms with purpose. During long evenings by the fire, they shared their stories. Chenoa spoke more about that terrible night 15 years ago, giving Mason details that helped him finally lay his ghosts to rest. He learned that the warrior who had tried to catch Emma had himself been killed in the chaos, shot by another settler who had come to help. He learned that the Apache children who had been kidnapped were eventually found and returned safely, but only after the violence had already spiraled beyond control. Mason shared his own stories of Clara and Emma, memories he had locked away for so long. He told the sisters about Emma's love of wildflowers, about Clara's beautiful singing voice, about the dreams they had shared for their future. Speaking these memories aloud to sympathetic listeners helped transform them from sources of pain into treasured gifts. They also faced challenges from the outside world. Some neighboring ranchers were suspicious and hostile about Mason harboring Apache women. There were threats, attempts at intimidation, even one night when someone tried to burn down his barn. But Mason and the sisters stood firm, and gradually even the most prejudiced neighbors came to respect their determination and see the women as individuals rather than symbols. The sisters also struggled with their own doubts and fears. There were nights when they questioned their choice, when they missed their people and their old ways. Mason gave them space to grieve what they had lost, even as they built something new. As the seasons turned and the year approached its end, all three knew a decision was coming. Would Chenoa and Ayana return to their tribe's borders and choose to stay with their people? Would they venture out entirely on their own, or might they remain with Mason, continuing the unexpected family they had formed? The answer came one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and gold. Chenoa spoke first, acknowledging that the year had passed and the time for choosing had arrived. She admitted that part of her would always belong to her people, that Apache blood and tradition would always run through her veins. But she declared that she had found a new purpose here, helping people regardless of whether they were Apache or white, and she wanted to continue that work. Ayana added that she felt the same. She had discovered who she was meant to be, and that person existed in this new space they had created together. This place where old divisions mattered less than individual character and choice. Mason listened to them with a full heart. He told them that this ranch, this home, belonged to all of them now. He had no children of his own, and with his age advancing, he knew his years were limited. He proposed something that shocked even himself. He would deed the ranch to them, split equally between the two sisters, so that after his death they would have security and a true home of their own. The sisters protested this was too much, but Mason insisted. He explained that they had given him back his life, had helped him redeem the years the locusts had eaten, had shown him that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds. The ranch was the only thing of value he possessed, and he wanted it to go to people who would honor both the past and the future. When the day came to meet Chenoa and Ayana's father at the tribal borders as promised, the three of them rode out together. The leader arrived with a small group of warriors, but the tension of their first meeting was gone, replaced by cautious respect. The father looked at his daughters and saw the transformation in them. They stood taller, spoke with confidence, and radiated a sense of purpose he had rarely seen. Mason stood beside them, not as a captor or owner, but as an equal and ally. The sisters told their father they had chosen to remain with Mason, but they wanted his blessing and promised to stay connected to their people. They invited him to visit, to see what they had built, to understand the new path they were forging. The father was quiet for a long time. Then he did something unexpected. He dismounted and approached Mason. The two men stood face to face, representatives of cultures that had been at war for generations. The father spoke in careful English, acknowledging that Mason had kept his word, that his daughters were thriving, and that perhaps there were more ways to honor their ancestors than simply repeating the past. Mason responded with equal respect, thanking the leader for trusting him with his daughters, admitting he had gained far more than he had given, suggesting that perhaps their unlikely alliance could be a model for others. The two men clasped forearms in a gesture of mutual respect, and something profound shifted in that moment. It was a small thing in the vast scope of history, but for the people present it represented hope that understanding could bridge even the deepest divides. The years that followed proved that hope well-founded. Mason's Ranch became known as a place of healing and reconciliation, where people of different backgrounds could come together in mutual respect. Chenoa's reputation as a healer grew, and Ayana's horse breeding brought prosperity. Mason himself lived another decade, content and fulfilled in ways he never imagined possible after Clara and Emma's death. When Mason finally passed in his sleep one peaceful night, with both sisters at his bedside, they buried him next to Clara and Emma. On his tombstone they inscribed words that captured his transformation. He learned to see with new eyes, to forgive with a full heart, and to build bridges where others saw only walls. The ranch continued to thrive under the sisters' management, and it became a gathering place for those seeking to heal divisions and build understanding. The story of Mason and the Apache sisters spread throughout the territory, inspiring others to question their prejudices and consider reconciliation. Chenoa eventually married a white doctor who shared her passion for healing, and together they established a clinic that served everyone, regardless of background. Ayana chose to remain unmarried, dedicating herself to her horses and becoming one of the most respected breeders in the territory. But both women maintained strong connections to their Apache heritage, regularly visiting their tribe and ensuring their children grew up knowing both worlds. The small swing that had belonged to Emma remained on Mason's porch throughout all these years. Kept in good repair by the sisters as a memorial, it became a symbol of what was lost, but also what was found, of the tragedy that nearly consumed Mason, but ultimately led to redemption. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind whispered through the grass and the stars filled the infinite sky, visitors to the ranch could sometimes hear the faint creak of that old swing moving gently, as if pushed by unseen hands. Some said it was Emma's spirit, finally at peace, knowing her father had found healing. Others claimed it was simply the wind, nothing more. But those who had known Mason, Chenoa, and Ayana understood a deeper truth. The swing represented something far more powerful than ghosts or wind. It represented the possibility of transformation, the courage to change, the strength to forgive, and the wisdom to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The Apache sisters' promise had been kept in ways none of them could have imagined that desperate night, when two frightened women knocked on a bitter old man's door. They had promised to never forget his kindness, and they never did. But more than that, they had helped him remember how to be human again, how to love, how to hope, and how to honor the past by creating a better future. In the end, the story of Mason and the sisters became part of the legends of the Old West, passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even across the deepest divides, understanding and compassion can build bridges that change everything. It stood as testament to the truth that we are all capable of transformation, that hatred can be overcome with courage and truth, and that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most profound redemptions. The ranch still stands today, preserved as a historical site, and visitors can still see that old swing on the porch, can walk through the rooms where three wounded souls found healing together, can stand on the land where an impossible family was forged from pain and made whole through understanding. The story reminds us that while we cannot change the past, we can always choose how we move forward from it. And sometimes the bravest choice is to open our doors to those we have been taught to fear, to listen to stories that challenge everything we believe, and to allow our hearts to be transformed by truth and compassion.